My Madonna kit is not working. Okay, hope you've heard what I've said so far. A teacher's voice should carry, so I'm hoping it has. So as Christians, we believe that God leads us in life. He never leaves us, he walks life with us, and he equips us and sculpts us into perfection. I don't know about you, I don't quite feel perfect. I can say that quite honestly. But we're perfected, we're being changed from glory to glory for his glory. His glory, not our own. So our success, our achievements are not God's aim. His aim is to turn us to look like him and to achieve things for his glory. I wonder if that's how you live life today. That was quite a challenge for me over the last fortnight as I thought about this message. Think about that for a moment. Are you at peace where God has placed you? Are the circumstances you find yourself in okay? Are you surrendered to God? Now that's a hard one. Think about every aspect of your life. Are you surrendered to God and his will for your life? And perhaps a bit more of a challenge, are you willing to step out of that safety and this security? So let's hear a little bit about Esther. She's the queen of the largest empire of its time. She has come from a lowly position. She was an orphan and she was an immigrant. So such an amazing rise in her career to position as queen. It's like a Disney film, a rags to riches story. Or is it? We find her in a politically not correct situation. As queen, she was the top concubine for the king's harem. It's a family service, and I'm not going to explain what a concubine did. Use your imaginations, or perhaps not. Looking at it with 21st century eyes and equality in mind, this really wasn't a position she wanted to find herself in. Esther was recognized for her looks and how she brought pleasure to the king. Not perhaps where you'd expect a God-fearing woman to find herself. But we must remember, God doesn't promise us a perfect life or an environment that we necessarily feel comfortable in. He does say, however, he will equip us and protect us and provide for us in that situation. As we live out, and this is the key bit, as we live out his purposes in our lives. Remember, he is reclaiming this world. It's not already claimed. It's been claimed on the cross, but it is being transformed day by day through you, through me, through all the Christians in the world. We are his soldiers. We are his implements, his instruments here on earth. Esther was set, the story of Esther, the history of Esther, was set around 500 BC. Esther was in exile as part of the Jewish peoples whose ancestors had been carried off by people who had beaten Israel at war. Victorious armies had carried them off. The Persian Empire was a bit like the Roman Empire. If you are historians, please close your ears because I'm not a historian. It was immensely powerful, and it had many other cultures acting as slaves and an immigrant workforce for Persia. That's incredibly important in how Esther places her argument with the king. I wonder if you've read these Old Testament stories and thought of them as purely allegorical. Are they just a story? Are they teaching us something? Well, in doing my research, I discovered that this description of Susa, the citadel of Susa, in the Bible is absolutely accurate. It exists in Iran, and there is even a relief bust of Xerxes and his sons there. This is no story. This is an account. Read it when you get home and listen to the detail in the reality. That's no made-up story. I'm a designer, and I love the descriptions of the purple and the white woven fabrics that created the banquet curtains. I love the precious stone walkways that they walked across. That's not made up. That's real. This is a true account of God intervening on behalf of his people. Oddly, if you read that story when you get home, Esther is the only book where God isn't mentioned by name. Think of that. A story in the Bible that doesn't mention God. But as you read it, that story is pregnant with God's presence. Esther and Mordecai are exiles, Jews that happen to be in Persia at just the right time. Coincidence? Esther is chosen to be queen, but we've already seen that she's come from a rags to riches story. Or was that God's favor on her? And Mordecai finds himself in a position to overhear a plot to kill the king. Coincidence? I don't think so. And that extending the scepter to Esther to allow her to speak, being no doubt that most people would have been killed at that point for the impertinence of actually assuming that the king would actually speak to her and have no invitation. A coincidence, or yet again, God's favor? And I like the irony, the twist at the end. It's suitable for Disney in a way, apart from its murder, so maybe not. But ironically, where Haman has built the gallows to kill Mordecai, there's a twist. And he finds himself killed on that same gallows. I like some of these twists. It's an irony, but it also shows God showing his strength and his power and his care for you and me. All coincidence, or the reality of God's people living as part of God's plan and being planted in the right place at the right time? But I'd like to suggest that there's something else going on here. So we have God's plan, but we also have godly behaviors and obedient people. Mordecai has raised Esther in the ways of God, like we are doing with our children. Mordecai has walked closely with God and advises Esther to step into the dangerous situation with confidence. Dad and I were discussing this on the way to here today. Imagine a cousin putting his cousin in danger, but he had the strength of the confidence that he knew God would be with her. And God reveals to Mordecai that Esther was in this situation for such a time as this. We'll come back to that phrase, as I bet many of you know I will come back to it. Esther and the Jews took this very seriously. Esther stepping into that dangerous position wasn't taken lightly. They prayed and they fasted for 3 days. No water and no food. You know what the temperatures are like out there. If we had no water, we'd soon know about it. And they were in similar temperatures. And yet they committed that. They were committing Esther and God's purposes to prayer and fasting. And Esther, while scared, and being no doubt she was scared, we can see what she's saying. She's explained desperately to Mordecai what it would mean if the king didn't extend that scepter. But while scared, she's obedient both to God and to Mordecai. She's got 2 eyes on God, 2 ears open, and I bet she was waiting for, stop, don't worry about it. We'll do it a different way. But that didn't come. And she acts. So what's the aim of this message for us this morning? The saga shows us how we should live in this world as Christians. Each one of us are called to be part of this world and part of God's plan. Now, this I struggled with. We're called to be different. Now, we know that. We say that regularly in church. But our attitudes, our perceptions are different to the world, or they should be. Can I ask you this morning, are you different to your neighbours? Are you different at the school gate? Is everything in your life measured according to God and according to his laws? If we only knew it, God is working through us in every part of our day, or would if we allowed him to. We may not like where we are in life. We may not approve of the people's behaviours around us. But we are called to be there and to keep our eyes on God. If we only knew what God could do through us, that would be a bit easier, I think. But we don't. The only thing that God tells us to do is stay close to him and be obedient. Remember, his long-term plan is from the past, the now, and the future. Ours is just for our generation, and perhaps the one either side of us if we're praying for our children, or praying and thanking God for our ancestors, the ones we know about. But his is the whole world and redeeming it for his purposes and bringing in his kingdom. If we love God, remember all things work together for good if we're following his purposes and if we're obedient. Esther had no power as a woman, no power as an orphan, no power as an immigrant. And yet, God turned the tables on her situation and on man's scheming ways. I wonder if you find yourself in man's scheming ways at the moment. Just remember, God can turn that situation around. God's purposes and God's obedient people. We've heard that story now. God's purposes and God's obedient people working hand in hand together to realize what? Success for the people? No. The coming of the kingdom of God on earth. Esther used her position? Yes. She appealed to the king's best interests. Now we're back to the immigrant workforce. She told King Xerxes that he would lose his workforce if he killed God's people, the Jews. So she appealed. She used intelligence. We are allowed to use our own attributes. Esther used favor to achieve freedom for her people. She worked within the constraints of the day and her circumstances, but she was as wise as a serpent and innocent as a dove. And she reversed the power dynamic by inviting the king and Haman to her banquet. Very clever. Can I suggest God gave her that idea when she was in prayer and close to him? So Esther and Mordecai's characters, nor their circumstances, were perfect. This is really no Disney scene. They lived as we do in a corrupt society and world that we would really prefer not to be in. They were surviving, yes, perhaps with even the dreams of returning to Jerusalem one day in the back of their minds. But their minds were on the present. They had to be. Their lives depended on it, but they were living in the present. And that's my challenge to us today. We need to offer God who we are, weaknesses and all. We are where God's put us, and I suggest for a purpose. But are we ready? Are we expectant to do what God asks us? Jesus hung around with sinners, and he worked with them, and he enjoyed being with them, and he calls us to do the same. He calls us to be in this messy world and live for him. Jesus did not come to save the saved. He came to save the lost. And often we find our places and our positions in the places where non-Christians are, and we wonder what we're doing there. We are God in those circumstances. If you have a future goal and a dream, is that dominating your thoughts this morning? I don't know where this idea came from as I was preparing, but I wonder if there's somebody here who has a dream and a goal that's absolutely consuming them. That's not what God is asking. God is asking you to live your daily life close to Him, yes, with dreams, but living in the now. I'm not saying dreams are wrong, but they can get in the way of what God wants to do with you now. We need to keep our minds on the present and live in the now. Leave the future to God. For you are here for such a time as this. Not for tomorrow, but for such a time as this. I read this recently. It is the process, not the outcome, that is glorifying to God. It's who you are now. Not what you do, not what you'll achieve, but who you are. And that changed my perspective. Are you like me? Get excited about conversions, justice being meted out, helping the poor. Yes, but that's not what we're called to. We're called to stay close to God. And those issues, those things will be dealt with, but as we walk God's path for us. Our responsibility is to live for God in the here and now. Hidden in this story is a health warning, and this certainly isn't the Disney-esque side of things. God's will be achieved with or without you. Let that sink in for a second. That's chilling. God's will be achieved with or without you. Listen again to what Mordecai said to Esther. Do not think that because you are in the king's house, you alone of all the Jews will escape. For if you remain silent at this time, relief and deliverance for the Jews will arise from another place. But you and your father's family will perish. That's not Disney. We do have a choice in life. And it's our calling to step into God's plan for us. And believe me, He has a plan for every single one of you, whether you expected to be in this congregation today or you didn't. But it's our choice to step in or to say no thank you. I don't know about you, but that brought my heart to palpitations. That's desperate. Do you want to miss out on what God has for you because your dream is greater, your plans are bigger, or, as it says in the Bible, just give me time to go and bury my dead. Just give me time to water and train my oxes. No. Now is God's time for you. Now you are here for such a time as this. Perhaps if you were Esther or the very proud cousin Mordecai, you would have been happy to settle for what man would have said was great success. Esther as queen. What higher position could she have achieved? But God wasn't interested in that. God's purposes for Esther were to save his people from death, to be obedient. That's what Esther was called to be, is obedient. That's what we are called to be, obedient. What would we have done? Would we have acted and had the courage to stand and put our lives on the line? If I die, I die. Would we thought, it's better not to rock the boat? That's how I often feel. I don't want to pick up the pieces afterwards. Whilst these thoughts were in my mind, I was watching the news, which is rather depressing at the moment. And I thought to myself, I wonder if I found myself in a similar position of influence, would I have the courage to speak out? What if I was advising Boris? Would I have spoken up against some of his actions or supported him? God help me. What would I be saying to President Biden about China and Taiwan currently? Who knows? And even worse, what about being in Putin's advisory body? I think if we stepped out and spoke up there, we'd probably be dead within minutes. Where is God asking you to be? Where is he asking you to move to or stay? What is he asking you to speak up about? And what actions is he asking you to take? There's not one of you that he hasn't got a plan for, so he's asking you something. What dream is he asking you to follow or lay down? Or what situation is he asking you to live in and put up with? You may not be asked to do anything as life-threatening as Esther. However, the impact may be beyond your wildest dreams. It took an everyday Christian to take a Mr. Bernardo to see destitute children living on the streets of London. And what came of that? Bernardo's charity. But that was done by one normal, everyday Christian started that. What could we do? What is God asking you to do? One thing we can be certain of, we are all born for such a time as this. And God wants to work through us. But do we have the courage? And more important in this time of life, do we have the time to spend? Do we give God the time to talk to us? Remember, Esther was scared. She reminded Mordecai that she could be killed for her actions. And yet her response was, if I die, I die. She had courage and confidence in God. She was where God had placed her, and she listened to God and was led by him. Think of the positions and places you're going to find yourself in this week. Work, home, holiday. What is God placing on your heart to do? The questions are, do we live close enough to God? Do we hear him speak? Do we give him our daily lives? Do we fast and pray and take our direction from him? And very importantly, do we expect to hear from him? And if we don't, remember, for if you remain silent at this time, relief and deliverance for the Jews will arise from another place. Are you happy for someone else to achieve what God has planned for you? Do you have a burning desire to follow God? Imagine missing out on that. In praying this morning, I laid this all before God, and imagine my surprise when this is the last of one of my readings. This is what I read. Am I fully prepared to allow God to grip me by his power and do a work in me that is truly worthy of himself? Wow. Sanctification is not my idea of what I want God to do for me. Sanctification is God's idea of what he wants to do for me. But he has to get me into the state of mind and spirit where I will allow him to sanctify me completely, whatever the cost. Who knows what God will achieve through us? Let's be courageous and willing this week to follow him.
Thank you, Debbie.